Hey friends, in this video I'm going to show you how we can take a digital image like this and make it look like it was shot on realistic film using a very powerful plugin called Dehancer Pro. Now before I show you my workflow, if you want to download Dehancer, you can get 10% off if you use code JamesDell. This is not a sponsored video, but Dehancer did reach out in exchange for an honest review, and an honest review you're gonna get. Let's jump into it. Okay, so here we are in Final Cut Pro, and if you're editing this in a different software, it may look different, but the same techniques will apply to get the same results. So in Final Cut Pro, the first thing I want to do is drop an adjustment layer on top of the clip here in my timeline. So I come up here to adjustment layer, grab this, drop it on top, and size it to fit. Next, I want to add Dehancer Pro to this adjustment layer. I come over here to my effects tab and search for Dehancer Pro. I have it ready to go here. So I drop that on top of my adjustment layer. Now, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to disable all of these modules that are turned on in Dehancer Pro, just so you can see in real time what is happening to this video as I add effects to it. So I think everything is turned off there. Okay, we're good to go. So I shot this clip on the Canon R5 in C-Log 3, and I want to relay that information to Dehancer so it can convert it into a Rec 709 color space. So I come up here to Input and Source, and I select Choose Camera, Vendor, it was the Canon R5, and just like that, now our C-Log 3 has been converted to Rec 709, so now we have a color space that we can actually work with. So now that we have our camera settings dialed in, there are 3 steps that I take every time I'm color grading in Dehancer Pro. And the very first step I'm going to take here is this film module. I'm going to make sure this is enabled. And this is where we select our film stock, and there are over 60 to choose from. So you got Kodak Portra 800, you got Fujifilm, Fujichrome. Honestly, I haven't used most of these film stocks yet because I tend to stick to these Kodaks. I think they look beautiful. So for this example, I'm going to stick with the Kodak Vision 3 250D. It has this push-pull slider here, and you can see how that's affecting the image. I think I'm going to leave it somewhere on the right, like here. Next, for my second step that I take every time, I come down to the expand module, make sure that's enabled. And I'm going to bring up the waveforms, Command 7. And this is where I set my black and white point. So I want to add a little more contrast to this image, so I'm going to lower my blacks till they're just above 0. And then the white point, I kind of like it where it is. I don't like blowing out my whites, especially for an image like this. It's already very dynamic as is. So I'm going to leave that for now. And next, the third thing that I do every time, I'm going to come down here to print, make sure that's enabled. And in print, we have a couple of different options. Now, because I'm using Kodak Vision 3 250D up here, I'm going to keep it in the Kodak family and use this Kodak 23A3 print film. I'm going to close my waveforms. And in this module here, I'm going to set my target white. I actually like my whites to be a little bit warmer for this image. I think it just works. So now that I've taken those 3 steps, we can kind of just bounce around within these modules and figure out how to dial in this image. So I want to add more saturation to this. So I'm going to come up to Film Developer, and we're going to enable that and use the color boost to add more saturation. So something like this looks good. I'm going to play around with the contrast boost. I think that's looking good. Maybe I'll add a little more color. Okay, so this image is looking good. I want to brighten it up just a little bit. Something like this looks good. Back in the print module, I'm going to raise the exposure just a touch. Something like that looks good. Okay, so our image is starting to take shape here. Now there's a couple of fun little features that we can add to this. So I want to add grain to this clip. Come down here to the grain module and click enable. Inside this module, there's plenty of different options to choose from, but if none of these are working for you, you can just click on custom, and then you can dial in grain to suit your own needs. But for this example, I'm going to leave it on a 65mm ISO 50. Higher the ISO, the more prominent the grain is going to be. So that looks really good to me. Under film grain, we have halation, which I already know is going to look really good for this image. If I toggle it on and off, you can see what it's doing, especially around those bulbs. I'm going to leave it on the Super 35. Next up, we have bloom, which again, I know is going to look really great for this image because there's a lot of color and a lot of lights. It's going to enable bloom. You can already see what it's doing to that image. Let's have a look at this video so far. Let's say I wanted to take down the highlights just a touch without having to touch the exposure itself. We can do that inside of film compression. Enable film compression. If I toggle that on and off, you can see the effect it's having. It's saving those highlights without affecting the shadows or midtones. Even just having that enabled makes such a huge difference. Let's take a look. I think that looks good. Let's move on to another example. So for this clip, the same steps apply. Grab your adjustment layer, drop it in on top of your clip, size it to fit, then head over to your effects panel, grab Dehancer Pro and drop it on top of your adjustment layer. Unlike the last example, I'm just going to leave the film modules on. So then we just repeat the process. Come up here to input and source, choose camera, Canon R5, and just like that, we already have a pretty decent image to work with. Now I have all these modules that are still turned on from our last session, so let's just dial them in for this image. I'm going to continue working with the Vision 3 250D. Just play around with this push-pull slider to see what we can find. Kind of like a more contrasted image, so I'm going to leave it somewhere like there. Then I'm going to come down to the expand module and set my blacks and my whites. So the whites need to be raised quite a bit here. Something like that looks good. And the blacks we can crush just a little bit. All right, that looks good. Let's go down to our print. Make sure it's enabled. And then I'm going to select either the Kodak 2383 or we can play around with the Endura glossy paper. Kind of like the glossy paper, it's a little bit too contrasted, but we can fix that by coming up to the film developer and playing around with this contrast boost. Make sure it's enabled first. Something like this, and adding some saturation back to the image. Now it's starting to take shape. Let's head down and set our white point again. In the print module, I'm going to mess around with this color density slider. That looks good, just a tiny little touch there. That's looking good. Let's head down to our grain and figure out these effects here. So let's keep it where it was at this 35mm 250. Under grain halation, let's turn that on. Bloom, let's turn that on. Here we have film damage. Let's turn it up to 8mm so you can really see what it's doing. That's looking pretty good. Let's say I wanted to warm up this image. There are a couple of ways we can go about doing that. We can come up here to our technical adjustments where we have temperature comp. I could drag this up just a little bit. It's warming up that image, and I could add a tint by bringing this to the left, is adding a kind of a green tint. Kind of digging that. Let's have a look. That's looking good to me, but the film damage is a little bit much, so I'm going to dial that back and put it on 35mm instead. All right, that looks good. Film breadth, I'm not going to mess around with. Gate weave, I'm not going to mess around with either. The overscan is an interesting feature. There's a lot to choose from in here. I like this widescreen effect. I think that looks pretty cool. And then under that we have our vignette, which I'm going to leave off. So that looks pretty good to me, and as you can see, it takes no time at all to turn a digital image into something that looks like it was legitimately shot on film. It's pretty impressive. Okay, so real quick, let's do one more example, and I have 3 clips here on my timeline. Grab my adjustment layer just like always, except this time I'm just going to put it on this first clip, and I'll show you why in just a second. Then I'm going to come over to Effects tab, grab Dehancer Pro and drop it on top of our adjustment layer. Input our choose camera, Canon R5. Now let's just fine tune this clip. So as always, I'm going to stick with the Vision 3 250D because I love it. I'm going to come down here to my expand, so Command 7. I'm going to raise my whites and lower those blacks just a touch. Next, we come down to our print. It's already enabled. And for this example, I'm going to choose glossy paper. Okay, so I want to add some saturation to this image. I'm going to come up to Film Developer, Enable, play around with the color boost, something like this. And I'm going to play with the contrast boost. Going to leave it somewhere here. Looks good. So let's say I want to warm up this image, but I don't want to use the temperature comp up here. I can come down to Color Head. Inside Color Head, we have options here where we can add some warmth to our shadows, our midtones, etc. So I want to add some warmth to these highlights. I'm going to grab this highlight tone slider and pull it to the right. Something like that looks good. Let's go ahead and add some of our effects like halation. Now, if I wanted to see what the halation effect is actually adding to this image, I can click on mask mode and then I can hit enabled. And you can see there's just a blank screen, there's nothing happening here. But if I choose a more intense template like this 8mm here, you can start to see all these red areas show up in the image. That shows you how much the halation is actually affecting this image. So if I turn off mask mode, you can see that the halation is pretty intense, probably too much for this image. So I'm just going to dial it back and stick with the 35mm. So if I toggle this on and off, you can see the effect it's having. Then I'm going to come down here to bloom, make sure that's enabled. And if I choose something like the 16mm, you can see the effect that the bloom is having. I kind of like that dreamlike effect. By the way, I normally shoot with a black Pro Mist filter on my lens, but for this lens that I was using on this particular day, I don't have a Pro Mist filter. So having these effects like the bloom and halation built in to add that kind of dreamlike effect to your image is really handy to have. So if you haven't bought any filters and you are looking at this software for grading your footage, because it's like $450, but if you factor in all the effects that you're not buying, like a black Pro Mist filter, it actually might work out and this plugin doesn't seem so expensive all of a sudden. So this image looks good. I like a really punchy looking video, so I'm going to actually add more saturation back to this. I'm going to come up to Film Developer. Where are you? Here it is. I'm going to drag the color boost slider up. So let's have a look at this. Okay, so that's looking good. Let's say I want to add this effect to the next clip in my timeline. I can drag this adjustment layer over it, and of course it's going to affect the video below it. But if I want to treat this as its own individual edit, I can select the slice tool by hitting B on my keyboard and then making a slice on the adjustment layer. And now this adjustment layer in the center is affecting the clip directly underneath it. But for this example, I actually like how it's looking. I really think the halation and bloom works really well for this image. So I'm going to continue to drag my adjustment layer over our third clip and let's see what we have. Okay, so we can make some adjustments to this clip. Again, we're going to slice our adjustment layer so it's just affecting the image underneath it. And now any edits that we make inside Dehancer Pro are just affecting the clip directly below. So for this image, I think I want to warm it up just a little bit. So I'm going to use the temperature comp slider up here. I'm going to slowly nudge that to the right, maybe like around 8 or 9. Looks good if I toggle that on and off. It's a very minor adjustment, but I also want to add some green tint to this image just for the sake of this tutorial. So I'm going to grab our tint comp. Way down you can see how much it's actually adding and back it off quite a bit. So something like this looks good, I think. Yeah, somewhere around there. So now let's have a look at our 3 clips altogether. Maybe add a little more contrast back to this third clip. I can come in here to Film Developer and the contrast boost. I can just pull that up a little bit. So that's looking nice and punchy. This is more my style. I really like this. So there you have it, guys. That is how I am now color grading my footage in Final Cut Pro using Dehancer Pro. Honestly, a month ago when Dehancer reached out to me about this collab, I was a little bit skeptical because at first this plugin was super overwhelming. There was just a lot to learn. There still is. I'm only a couple of weeks in using this plugin, and I'm sure if I look back on this video in a year, I'll probably cringe at my workflow. But for now, it works and I'm happy. I'm not a professional colorist by any means. I'm not coloring full-length feature movies. I'm just making content for YouTube and social media. So for my needs, this plugin is really just the perfect tool to have. I've been trying to think about a fair and balanced review. So I've been actually looking for faults with this plugin, and there's not much I can find apart from the elephant in the room, and that's the pricing. It is $450 if you want to download the full Dehancer Pro. There is a Dehancer Lite version if that's more in line with your budget. So the price is a little hefty, but you have to consider what you're getting. For me personally, Dehancer has everything in it that I need for color grading, so it has become my one-stop shop for color grading. Up until now, I've been using Film Convert, and I think I will do a comparison video of both of those. So if you're interested in seeing me compare Film Convert to Dehancer Pro, make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss that video. So apart from the price, I mean, if I was to get really nitty gritty about it, I would like the ability to be able to shuffle these modules around and kind of customize it more to my needs. I don't know if that's even possible. I don't know if it would even make sense, but I'm really just searching here. But if you are thinking about downloading Dehancer Pro, remember that you can use my code JamesDell by clicking the link in the description below, and that will get you 10% off your order. Also, there is a 7-day free trial on their website if you want to check that out and see if it's for you. Okay guys, that is it for me. Thank you Dehancer Pro for reaching out and asking me to do this collab. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you guys for watching. I will see you in the next one. Peace.